In the murky, crushing depths of the Cold War, a silent game of cat and mouse was being played for the fate of the world. For decades, the rules of this game were dictated by physics and patience. Submarines were slow, deliberate predators moving through the dark, like sharks waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The United States Navy had mastered this art. They believed that silence was the ultimate weapon. They built their submarines to be holes in the water, black voids that sonar could not see and enemies could not hear. But in the early 1970s, the Soviet Union decided to flip the chessboard. They didn't want to play by American rules anymore. They didn't want to hide in the shadows. They wanted to scream through the ocean with such overwhelming power that stealth wouldn't matter. They wanted to build a machine so fast, so deep, and so advanced that it would render the entire U.S. Navy obsolete overnight. This ambition gave birth to Project 705 Lira, known to the terrified commanders of NATO simply as the Alfa Class. To understand the arrogance behind the Alpha, you have to understand the mind of the Soviet High Command. They were obsessed with the superweapon. They looked at the slow, careful American submarines and laughed. They saw weakness. They believed that the future of underwater warfare belonged to the fastest. So they gave their engineers a blank check and an impossible command. Build us an underwater interceptor, a fighter jet that swims. The engineers responded with a design that bordered on insanity. To make the submarine light enough to accelerate like a drag racer, they abandoned steel. Steel was heavy. Steel was for peasants. Instead, they decided to build the entire hull out of titanium. Titanium is a nightmare to work with. It requires welding in an argon oxygen-free atmosphere. It is incredibly expensive. The cost of sourcing and refining enough titanium to build a fleet of submarines was so astronomical that the Soviet shipyards became money pits. The CIA, observing the sheer cost of the project, nicknamed the Alpha the Golden Fish, joking that it would have been cheaper for the Kremlin to build the submarine out of solid gold bullion than to forge it from titanium. But the cost didn't matter. Only dominance mattered, but a light hull wasn't enough. To achieve the speeds the admirals demanded, the Alpha needed an engine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Standard pressurized water reactors were safe, but they were heavy and slow to power up. The Soviets wanted raw, unbridled energy. They installed a liquid metal-cooled reactor. Instead of water, the core was cooled by a molten mixture of lead and bismuth. This was dangerous technology. It was volatile. It was essentially a controlled nuclear meltdown waiting to happen. But the performance was staggering. This reactor allowed the Alpha to generate 40,000 horsepower in a hull half the size of an American boat. It could go from 0 to top speed in less than a minute. And that top speed was the stuff of nightmares. When the first intelligence reports of the Alpha's capabilities reached the Pentagon, faces went pale. The Alpha could dive to 2,000 feet, far below the crush depth of any NATO submarine. But worse, it could hit 41 knots. That is 47 miles per hour underwater. To put that in perspective, the standard American torpedo of the time, the Mark 48, struggled to catch anything moving that fast. The Soviet admirals boasted that they had created an invincible machine. They claimed that if an American submarine fired a torpedo, the Alpha captain could simply laugh, push the throttle forward, and outrun the weapon. It was the ultimate flex. They didn't need to be quiet. They just needed to be fast. They treated the ocean not as a place to hide, but as a highway to conquer. For a brief moment in the mid-70s, it seemed the Soviets had won. The U.S. Navy scrambled to upgrade their torpedoes, rushing the ADCAP Advanced Capability Program just to have a chance of hitting this titanium monster. But while the Russians were celebrating their speed records and their golden submarines, American acoustic analysts were looking at a different set of data, and they began to smile. Because in their quest for speed, the Soviets had forgotten the most fundamental rule of submarine warfare. If you are loud, you are dead. The Alfa Class was a marvel of engineering, but it was a disaster of acoustics. The massive pumps required to keep the liquid metal reactor from freezing generated a constant, high-pitched whine that reverberated through the hull. At high speeds, the water rushing over the titanium skin created flow noise so intense it was described by U.S. sonar operators as a threshing machine in a library. The Soviet Admirals had built a submarine that was faster than a torpedo, but it was also louder than a rock concert. The Americans realized that they didn't need to outrun the Alpha. They just needed to wait. This brings us to the tactical reality of the golden fish. The Soviet captains sitting in their titanium cockpits felt invincible, but they were also deaf. The noise of their own ship washed out their sonar sensors. At 40 knots, an Alpha was effectively blind to the acoustic world around it. It couldn't hear an enemy stalking it. To compensate for this terrifying blindness, Soviet doctrine developed a maneuver that became legendary in the West, the Crazy Ivan. Because the Soviet subs were deaf to anything behind them hidden in their acoustic baffles, they lived in constant paranoia that an American hunter-killer was trailing them. To check, the Soviet captain would suddenly order a violent hard turn. Hard rudder right, all ahead full. The submarine would swing 180 degrees in a matter of seconds, clearing its baffles to let the sonar listen to the water behind them. It was a maneuver born of fear. It was a desperate attempt to catch a spy. But the Americans were already 2 steps ahead. The U.S. Los Angeles class submarines, though slower, were ghosts. They were built with sound-dampening rafts, anechoic tiles, and advanced passive sonar arrays that could hear a shrimp snap its claws from a mile away. They didn't need to get close. They could trail the noisy Alpha from miles behind, sitting in the acoustic shadow. When the Soviet captain pulled a Crazy Ivan, the American sonar operators would hear the change in the Alpha's propeller RPMs and water flow seconds before the turn began. "Crazy Ivan target is turning," the sonar man would shout. The American captain would simply order a gentle turn, drifting silently out of the way, letting the Russian sub turn into empty water. The Soviet captain would check his sonar, hear nothing but the ocean, and assume he was safe. He would turn back to his original course, never realizing that the American hunter had just slipped back into position right behind his propeller, ready to fire a torpedo at point-blank range. The irony was crushing. The Soviet Union had spent billions of rubles, mined mountains of titanium, and risked nuclear catastrophe to build a fleet of super subs. They wanted to intimidate the West with brute force and speed. But in doing so, they had built the world's most expensive targets. The Alfa Class wasn't a predator. It was prey. It was a billion-dollar failure that proved once and for all that in the silent war of the deep, you can't outrun a bullet if you don't know who is holding the gun. While the Soviet admirals were laughing at the slow American submarines, the Americans were quietly mapping the location of every single Alpha in the ocean, ready to delete them from the map the moment the war turned hot. While the American sonar operators were tracking the loud screaming engines of the Alfa Class across the Atlantic, the Soviet crews inside the titanium hull were fighting a battle against an even deadlier enemy, their own technology. To understand why the Alfa Class was doomed from the start, you have to look into the heart of the beast. The Soviet engineers, in their quest for ultimate speed, had rejected the standard pressurized water reactors used by the rest of the world. Water was too heavy. It was too inefficient. Instead, they chose a liquid metal cooled reactor, LMR. Specifically, they used a lead-bismuth eutectic alloy. On paper, it was a masterpiece of theoretical physics. Liquid metal transfers heat much faster than water, allowing the reactor to be incredibly compact, while generating an insane amount of power, 40,000 horsepower, in a vessel half the size of a standard submarine. It was this density of power that allowed the Alpha to accelerate like a dragster. But in the brutal, unforgiving reality of naval operations, this miracle engine was a logistical nightmare that bordered on the suicidal. The lead-bismuth mixture had a melting point of 257 degrees Fahrenheit, 25 degrees Celsius. This single number was the sentence of death for the entire project. It meant that the reactor could never ever be turned off. If the temperature of the core dropped below 257 degrees, the liquid metal coolant would instantly flash freeze into a solid block. It would turn from a fluid into a rock. The coolant pipes would clog, the pumps would seize, and the reactor would transform from a power source into a radioactive brick, effectively killing the submarine instantly. This created a terrifying operational reality for the Soviet Navy. Unlike American submarines, which could shut down their reactors for maintenance repairs or simply to save fuel while sitting in port, the Alpha had to be kept alive 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It was a beast that could never sleep. This requirement turned the Alpha fleet into port queens. When the submarines were docked at the secret bases in the Kola Peninsula, they couldn't rely on their own internal power indefinitely. The Soviet Navy had to build an entire infrastructure just to keep them on life support. They constructed a special facility that pumped superheated steam from the shore into the submarine's heat exchangers to keep the liquid metal molten. It was a fragile umbilical cord. If a winter storm hit the base, which happened constantly in the Arctic, and the steam lines were severed, panic would erupt. There are declassified reports of Soviet officers running frantically around the frozen docks in sub-zero temperatures, screaming for emergency generators and backup boilers, knowing that they were fighting a ticking clock. If the temperature inside the reactor dropped for even an hour, the metal would harden, and $1 billion worth of titanium would be ruined forever. And that is exactly what happened. The history of the Alfa Class is littered with catastrophes that the Kremlin tried to hide. In 1972, the lead ship of the class K-64 suffered a microscopic leak in its primary cooling loop while at sea. As the pressure dropped, the liquid metal began to cool. The crew watched in horror as their gauges bottomed out. The lead bismuth alloy solidified inside the pipes. The reactor froze solid. The Soviet engineers back at the shipyard tried everything to melt it back down. They applied blowtorches, they injected superheated steam, they tried to drill into it. But it was impossible. The reactor was fused. The damage was so catastrophic that the hull of the submarine, made of that precious, ultra-expensive titanium, had to be cut open just to remove the dead heart. K-64 was towed away and scrapped before it had barely seen operational service. It was a humiliation of the highest order. The Soviets had built a race car that couldn't be parked. They had built a weapon that required more effort to keep alive than it took to fight the enemy. But the nightmare didn't end with maintenance. The human cost was staggering. The automated systems required to run this complex reactor meant that the crew was incredibly small, only about 30 highly trained officers, with no enlisted sailors. They were the elite of the Soviet Navy, the golden crew for the golden fish. But they were also the most terrified. The radiation shielding on the early Alpha models was notoriously poor or to save weight. Leaks were common. The sensors were unreliable. The officers knew they were sitting on top of a volatile experimental reactor that was prone to leaking radioactive liquid metal. They nicknamed the submarine the Samovar, a Russian tea kettle, because it was always hot, always whistling, and always threatening to boil over. Morale was non-existent. Serving on an Alpha was seen not as a promotion, but as a death sentence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the United States Navy was watching this slow-motion disaster with a mix of amusement and focused determination. The Americans had identified the threat of the Alpha's speed early on. They knew that in a straight sprint, the Alpha could outrun the Mark 48 torpedoes of the 1970s. This was unacceptable. But instead of trying to build a faster, more dangerous submarine to match the Soviets, instead of engaging in a contest of brute force, the Americans did what they always do: they innovated. They turned to their engineers and said, "Don't reinvent the wheel, just make the wheel smarter, faster, and deadlier." This initiated the ADCAP program, Advanced Capability, the Mark 48. ADCAP was not just an upgrade, it was a quantum leap in underwater weaponry. American engineers looked at the physics of the engagement. They increased the fuel capacity of the torpedo and improved the propulsor efficiency. The result was a weapon that could scream through the water at over 63 knots. The math changed instantly. The Alpha could do 41 knots. The ADCAP could do 63. In the cold calculus of naval warfare, if the pursuer is 50% faster than the target is already dead. The Soviet Admirals boast that they could outrun American weapons evaporated overnight. You can run at 40 knots, causing your hull to shake and your sonar to go blind, but you cannot outrun a robot that is closing the gap at highway speeds. But speed was only half of the American solution. The true genius of the ADCAP lay in its brain. The Alpha was fast, but it was dumb. The ADCAP was brilliant. The Americans upgraded the guidance system with digital logic that was decades ahead of anything in Moscow. The new torpedoes didn't just chase a sound, they predicted it. If an Alpha captain tried to use his speed to perform evasive maneuvers, banking and turning to shake the lock, the ADCAP wouldn't just follow the wake. It would calculate the intercept trajectory. It would cut corners. It would anticipate where the submarine was going to be, not where it was. Furthermore, the ADCAP exploited the Alpha's greatest weakness, its noise. Remember, the Alpha was the loudest submarine in the ocean. To the sonar seeker in the nose of a Mark 48 ADCAP, the Soviet sub wasn't a stealthy target. It was a screaming beacon. The torpedo could lock onto the Alpha's acoustic signature from miles away. It could differentiate between the submarine and decoys. It could ignore the background noise of the ocean and home in on the specific frequency of the Alpha's screaming pumps. The Soviet advantage of speed had been completely nullified by American software and sensor technology. The Alpha had been designed to outrun dumb torpedoes from the 1960s, but against the ADCAP it was just a loud, expensive target dying tired. The strategic irony was profound. The Soviet Union had bankrupted itself, building a fleet of titanium hot rods. They had sacrificed safety, stealth, and reliability on the altar of speed. They believed that superior specifications on a piece of paper would win the war. They thought that if they had the highest number in the speed column, they were superior. But the United States proved that warfare is not top trumps. It is not about who has the biggest engine. It is about the complete system. The U.S. Navy countered the brute force of the Alpha, not with a faster submarine, but with a smarter ecosystem. They used the SOSUS network to find it. They used the Los Angeles class to track it silently, and they used the ADCAP torpedo to kill it. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union began to realize their mistake. The Alfa Class was a strategic failure. It was a hangar queen, a term pilots use for a plane that looks beautiful sitting in the hangar, but breaks every time you try to fly it. The maintenance costs were bleeding the Soviet Navy dry. The special infrastructure required to keep the lead bismuth molten was failing as the Soviet economy crumbled. One by one, the golden fish were pulled from service. Their retirement was not dignified. Because the reactors were filled with a frozen radioactive heavy metal mixture, they couldn't be easily defueled or scrapped. They became toxic liabilities. The Soviets simply towed them to isolated bays in the Arctic and left them to rot, floating monuments to hubris and failed engineering. The story of the Alfa Class and the American response is the perfect microcosm of the Cold War. The Soviets asked, "Can we build it?" and pushed physics to the breaking point to say yes. The Americans asked, "Should we build it?" and focused on practical lethal efficiency. The Soviets built a monster that terrified its own crew more than the enemy. The Americans built a leash that turned that monster into a trophy. As the Cold War drew to a close, the ocean floor was not littered with American submarines that were too slow. It was the graveyard of Soviet ambitions that were too fast for their own good. The golden fish had been caught not by a faster fish, but by a smarter fisherman equipped with the ultimate spear. And as the Alpha program died a quiet radioactive death, the U.S. Navy was already preparing its next move, a submarine designed not just to kill the Alpha, but to dominate the entire ocean for the next century. The story of the Soviet Alfa Class has one final ironic twist that cemented American dominance for the next half-century. In military history, there is a recurring theme. The Soviet Union builds a paper tiger, a weapon that looks terrifying on spec sheets, and the United States responds by building a real monster to kill it. We saw it with the MiG-25 scare birthing the F-15 Eagle. And in the depths of the ocean, the exact same thing happened. The Alfa Class, despite being a maintenance nightmare and an acoustic disaster, succeeded in one thing: it scared the Pentagon. The U.S. Navy looked at the 40-knot speed of the Alpha and decided they didn't just want to catch it, they wanted to erase it. They initiated a program to build the ultimate predator of the deep. They gave their engineers a blank check, ignoring cost, to create a submarine that combined the speed of the Alpha with the silence of a black hole. The result was the USS Seawolf. If the Alpha was a drag racer built of glass, the Seawolf was a main battle tank built of diamond. Launched at the very end of the Cold War, the Seawolf SSN-21 remains to this day the most advanced hunter-killer submarine ever put into the water. The American engineers achieved the holy grail of hydrodynamics. They built a boat that was faster than the Los Angeles class, capable of diving deeper and carrying twice as many weapons, up to 50 torpedoes and Tomahawk missiles, in an automated room the size of a warehouse. But the true terror of the Seawolf was its acoustics. Using a revolutionary propulsor system instead of a traditional propeller and coated in advanced anechoic tiles, the Seawolf was 70 times quieter than the initial Los Angeles class. At 20 knots, the Seawolf was quieter than a Soviet submarine sitting at the dock with its engines turned off. It was effectively a void in the ocean. The U.S. Navy had solved the puzzle. They had combined the brute force speed the Soviets craved with the stealth the Americans perfected. When the Seawolf entered the water, the Soviet advantage didn't just shrink, it evaporated. The Alpha was no longer a threat. It was target practice. By the time the first Seawolf was ready to prowl the Atlantic, the Soviet Union was collapsing under the weight of its own economic failures. The Alpha program played a significant role in that bankruptcy. The maintenance costs of the golden fish were astronomical. The infrastructure required to keep the lead-bismuth reactors from freezing was bleeding the Soviet Navy dry. As the ruble crashed and the Berlin Wall fell, the Kremlin looked at their fleet of titanium hot rods and realized they couldn't afford the gas, let alone the repairs. The order was given: scuttle the fleet. The Alpha submarines were pulled from service one by one, decades ahead of their intended lifespan. Their retirement was not dignified. It was a funeral for an entire philosophy. Because of the frozen lead-bismuth reactors, the Alphas couldn't be easily scrapped like normal steel submarines. They were radioactive hazards. You couldn't just cut them up. So the Soviets did the only thing they could: they towed them to isolated bays in the Arctic Circle, specifically the Gromyka Naval Base, and abandoned them. The pride of the Soviet Navy, the billion-dollar titanium wonder weapons, became toxic waste. For years, they sat rusting in the snow, their reactors cooling into solid blocks of poison, guarded by a skeleton crew of unpaid sailors. It was a pathetic end to the machine that was supposed to rule the world. The superweapon had become a Superfund site. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy found itself in a unique position. The Seawolf was so effective and so expensive, costing $3 billion per sub, that with the Soviet Union gone, they didn't even need to build the planned fleet of 29 ships. They only built 3. That's how total the victory was. The threat had vanished so completely that the Alpha killer became overqualified for the job. The U.S. Navy pivoted to the Virginia class, a more versatile, cost-effective sub designed for the post-Cold War world. But the lesson remained etched in history. The Soviet Union had bankrupted itself trying to build superweapons that ignored reality. They chased the highest numbers on the spec sheet, highest speed, deepest dive, while ignoring reliability, logistics, and stealth. Today, if you look at the modern Russian Navy, you see a silent admission of defeat. The new Russian submarines like the Alfa Class have largely abandoned the exotic technologies of the Alfa. They went back to steel hulls. They went back to pressurized water reactors. They started copying American designs, focusing on silence rather than raw speed. After 40 years, they finally admitted that the Americans were right and all along. The path to underwater dominance isn't through brute force and liquid metal. It is through silent sensors and sustainability. The Alfa Class remains a fascinating chapter in Cold War history. It was a machine that pushed the boundaries of physics. It was fast, it was deep, and it was aesthetically beautiful. But it was a failure of strategy. It serves as a reminder that arrogance is a dangerous engineer. The Soviet admirals laughed at the slow American submarines, mocking their caution. But in the end, the tortoise didn't just beat the hare. The tortoise built a better shell, better eyes, and a smarter brain, while the hare burned itself out, froze to death, and was left to rot by the side of the road. The ocean is a cruel mistress. She does not respect speed. She respects silence. And in the silence of the deep, the U.S. Navy remains the undisputed king. The Cold War underwater was won not by the loudest scream, but by the quietest whisper. And that whisper spoke American.